welcome to the essay. Today I'm here with Lange, Director of the Mineral and Energy Economics Program at the Colorado School of Mines, and we're going to talk a little bit about the U.S. energy policy, the future of mining, critical minerals, and all of that. So, Ian, thanks for joining me here today.
Happy to be here.
And so, last time we spoke, the Inflation Reduction Act had really just been announced, and it was still relatively unclear as to what the effects of this new bill were going to be. So maybe we can start looking at, what are some of the impacts that you've seen so far on the industries, particularly in the U.S.?
Well, we certainly have seen a lot more interest in midstream and upstream mining from the automakers, which I think was part of the plan, the plan, we'll say, to get the automakers a bigger part of the discussion around minerals. And so a number of different investments have happened, we'll say, from the downstream users to upstream parts of the industry. I will say, though, on the upstream side, not much has really changed. There are things like the DOE loan program has been moving forward, giving out loans. They're kind of more on the midstream side. They don't really provide those loans to mines per se, but they're for the midstream part of a mine. There are, I guess, continued discussion and continued interest in different critical mineral issues, but we haven't seen many mines, we'll say, like move forward or get to a point of opening and production. I think one of the things that I found most enlightening was this issue in, I believe it was February, where the Jervois cobalt mine in Idaho, again, depending on who you listen to or who you talk to, it got pretty close to being opened, and then it just said, actually, we're not going to open. Prices are too low. And from a political perspective, I think it's hard to understate how big of a decision that was, right? That's a critical mineral mine in the United States. And, it had been given loans for the feasibility studies and other things like that, or grants. I can't remember the loan or grant for the feasibility studies. But basically, operationally, it wasn't profitable. At least that's the story Jervois is telling right now. And so, what that says to me is that these subsidies on the EV side for domestic content basically are not enough, right? Like, they can't operationalize a mine because we see that, a mine that's kind of ready to go just decides not to operate. And I guess if you're within Jervois, the whole story, right? But clearly no one was signing an offtake agreement to kind of guarantee a price for a while or something like that, or strategic behavior amongst other producers, specifically Chinese firms, kind of limited the ability of domestic downstream firms to sign an offtake agreement there. So it's, I will say, maybe that hasn't been a positive aspect so far, because it seems to be potentially revealing that, operationally, these mines just aren't profitable. You can give them the capital to get ready to go, but I mean, in some sense, they have to be operationally profitable for the firms to go through. And there's nothing in the Inflation Reduction Act that would, say, top up an offtake agreement, or that would provide a subsidy on the, operationally, to keep operating costs below the price of the minerals. And so, I would say that's kind of been a big deal. Now, the cobalt's kind of a special case. It is listed as critical mineral. There are these beliefs that cobalt demand will increase considerably. Many of these studies about cobalt demand have happened before there was kind of this shift to have less cobalt in a battery and more nickel. And so, is what we are seeing in that example, cobalt's not what we thought it was? Or is that, more like, indicative of the wider minerals markets? It's hard to believe that something like that would or is happening on the lithium side. That market's still, extremely hot, and there have been movements forward on a number of lithium projects in the United States, and then also with that investment from downstream auto firms, investing in these mining companies. So, so that certainly seems to have been one aspect that's changed since when we last talked, as the Inflation Reduction Act has kind of become operationalized. The other part where we would see a lot of minerals needed would be sort of like grid storage batteries. And those rules are relatively recently finalized by the IRS. And grid storage batteries have a similar domestic content adder to them. And so what I understand has been going on, or I'm told is going on, is that, basically it is really difficult to meet the domestic content adder for grid storage batteries. That is going to be in place in 2024 and 2025 and 2026. And so there's a race to get these batteries, commencing construction this year before the domestic content requirements, really pick up for the adder and on the subsidy. And so it'd be interesting to see, what does that do for this, short term? We have a huge demand for these grid storage batteries projects kind of get started. But then will there really just be like a big drop off because or it's very difficult to find batteries and the components that meet the domestic content requirements, in years 2024, 2025, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like this idea of domestic content that goes into the batteries, it's kind of evolved since the initial IRA came out, where, we've seen quite a bit of, deals and stuff and agreements being formed between the US and other countries. I was recently in Australia for our Melbourne event, and a lot of people are talking about the impacts that the IRA actually will have there. So, maybe we could talk about kind of the global impact and,
okay.
Looking at these kind of agreements between the US and various countries, is that kind of the best way forward in terms of these metals value chains?
Well, certainly, a lot of people are excited about the domestic content, we'll say extra subsidies that come for EVs and say grid storage batteries. And so that's kind of leading to this pressure of signing these free trade agreements or getting these other countries, sort of considered as domestic content. Generally in the discussions that I'm hearing, like it's not clear that signing these other free trade agreements are going to, we'll say, solve the problem, for lack of a better word, of getting domestic content, or getting, basically the batteries that have enough domestic content to qualify. Mm-hmm. So there's still some concern that things aren't going to ramp up quick enough to meet those requirements, even if you bring in a larger base of countries. And similarly, obviously, the other thing that the Inflation Reduction Act has done globally is led to kind of a similar policy from the European Union, and now they have their own domestic content goals. And so, in some sense, you can think of the OECD or the Western friendly nations. There's kind of competition in some sense for markets to bring in. I don't know if you want to call it either the clean or the friendly kind of metals. And so I think, that's also contributing a little bit to this concern that no matter how big you make the friendly countries, the number of friendly countries, it's going to be hard to meet these domestic content requirements. And these were things that people were talking about even in the beginning, right? Like it takes a while to ramp up production of these products. It takes a while, for new mines to come online, for new processing sources to get running, and to get to scale in some sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. We've kind of talked about, there's this focus on the critical minerals now, both in the US and globally. In terms of like the industry focusing on the energy transition, is this the right way to go about things? Is this going to kind of get the attention from investors and governments in the right places? Or are there areas where kind of we're missing the mark in terms of this focus?
Well, again, one of the things we might potentially be missing the mark on is this idea of almost all of these, the subsidies or the push for, say, domestic minerals in the United States is, I would say, like on the capital side, whether it be like the Defense Production Act or these DOE loan program offices, loans. They're more for, here's the capital to try to get the project up and running, but there's nothing kind of on the up and running side to help there. And that, again, like we saw with the Jeroboam planter, I think is still an open question of, are these domestic content rules going to be a big enough kick for downstream firms to then sign an offtake agreement at a price that's high enough to get these projects, operationally profitable, or at least to basically limit, the ability of Chinese producers to use their market power to say, hey, we can cut costs if you don't use a US or some other, country's minerals. So, don't worry about that domestic content kick, adder in or kicker. Just stay with us and we'll lower your costs a little bit. Obviously, the recent actions for gallium and germanium probably make people a little worried that more like that could happen if you just tend to rely on Chinese suppliers. But I mean, I think there's still these competing concerns that you have, sort of a large market in China that's ready and amply can supply these minerals, and probably at a lower cost than the US can supply them. And so why would a downstream user of minerals, forego the cheaper alternative for a more expensive alternative? And indeed, at least amongst, I don't want to say just academic economists, but amongst, I'd say professionals in the policy space, I have heard some discussion of, hey, we really want these technologies in people's hands. Why do we care where the minerals are coming from? If it's going to be more expensive to do it in the US, if it's going to be more expensive, to get off of the Chinese supply chain, that's bad from a perspective of getting these things in people's hands. Let's just, use the Chinese metals and, proliferate EVs, proliferate solar panels, proliferate, all the clean energy technologies. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that that's risen high enough that it's going to outpace the national security concerns. And again, things like the gallium and germanium decision probably really mute that kind of discussion. But, I would say there is a certain number of discussion that just basically says, what's more important is to get these technologies in people's hands, and you do that with lower prices.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost like accelerating the energy transition, or kind of continuing but slowing it down, but focusing on these domestic materials, it seems.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's a trade-off, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, last time we talked about kind of all of the issues with permitting as one of the big barriers to growth in the domestic mining sector. So has this kind of new push towards critical minerals helped that process?
I mean, it's hard to say that definitively on either side. Like, not from my experience, not much has really moved forward, for lack of a better word. There are a number of these issues with permitting end up coming down to court cases where they might be given their permit, but then there's a lawsuit saying, oh, it was given improperly or things like that. And, those things that won't stop without extremely large changes to, these the laws around these permitting. There is some move forward in terms of, trying to get these things done faster, and at the federal level, trying to get these permits done faster. Trying to coordinate between the agencies better, trying to make sure that those agencies are staffed up. But one of the reasons why this is a tough issue is that there are also state and local permits that the federal government, in some sense, isn't touching or can't touch. They can't necessarily override, or in certain scenarios, they can override state and local permitting issues, but they, generally they don't. And so, not only, it might be say, oh, we can get our federal permit easier, but some of our local permits will be harder. And then there are things like I don't remember the name of the Supreme Court case around the waters of the US rule, but, there's some discussion that limiting in what cases you might need like a Clean Water Act permit is helpful. But again, it's hard to say that, oh, like that's going to open up the spigot or something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then, I mean, my last question was kind of looking more just specifically at the EV sector. So, what's your outlook for uptake in the US for EVs? What's missing? What are some areas where kind of the mining and the downstream industries can continue to work together to kind of push or accelerate this sort of adoption?
Yeah, so I think, it's certainly sales are growing, obviously, in the United States and around the world. Perhaps around the world faster than in the United States, but there are certainly EV sales growing, a number of investments in these the downstream sort of manufacturing. And then you might also say in like gigafactories. And so lots happening there, right? I think the DOE kind of calls it a battery belt throughout Appalachia. And so there's lots of things happening there. And again, since we last talked, or, in the last 6-8 months, just the automakers really kind of diving in, thinking a lot about their mineral strategy, thinking a lot about procurement. And so, I think there seems to have been a lot of, I don't know if the word is coordination, but, that's definitely on people's minds now in the auto industry. They seem to be relatively all in on EVs. We're building a lot of production facilities, thinking about where they're getting their minerals from, whether it be, joint ventures or other kind of things like that happening. And so, very little seems to be slowing down that train. Obviously their main competitor would be internal combustion engines. We've seen OPEC plus, really trying to tighten oil supplies to keep prices up in the last 6 or 8 months. And so, one way you might say to slow down the EV sales would be, for really low gasoline prices or petrol prices. And that doesn't seem to be happening, right? So with the way OPEC plus is acting, they want to keep prices higher. They believe that there's, sort of an imbalance, so that gasoline demand is going to come back. And so that's really, I think, keeping a bit of pressure on the EV market, because, people can just say, okay, I can see the cost per mile of an EV. I can see the cost per mile, or expectation of a cost per mile from internal combustion engines, given my, gasoline prices into the future, and just little belief that either, the spigot's going to totally open at OPEC plus or something like that, to, really drive gasoline prices down. And so that's kind of keeping, maybe to use this car euphemism, it's keeping the pedal to the metal on EV sales, where a relaxation of oil prices could, ease up there a little.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, that's quite an in-depth, interesting overview of kind of what's going on in the US and globally. It'll be good to kind of catch up in another year and we can see where things have moved since then. But in the meantime, Ian, thanks for joining us at the essay.
Oh, yes, happy to. Have a good day. Thank you.